In 1260, an army of former slaves, outnumbered and facing an empire that had conquered half the known world without a single major defeat in 43 years, achieved the impossible. They didn't just win, they shattered history itself, saving 3 civilizations in a single afternoon. Think about this. 20,000 slave soldiers stood against the descendants of Genghis Khan, who had slaughtered 40 million people across continents. The survival of Islam, Christianity in Africa, and European civilization hung in the balance of what would happen in the next 6 hours. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a battle you've probably never heard of determined whether you're reading the Quran, the Bible, or Mongol scripture today. You're about to discover 3 mind-blowing revelations. First, the moment when the undefeated Mongols realized they'd walked into their own tactics used against them. Second, why a sultan threw away his helmet in the middle of combat, and how it changed everything. Third, the assassination that happened just days after victory that would reshape the Middle East for 250 years. How could this happen? How could an empire that conquered from China to Poland be stopped by former slaves? How could one spring in ancient Palestine determine the fate of 3 continents? And here's the most intriguing part. 2 men who should have been brothers in arms. One would save Islam, the other would kill him for it. This is their story. If you're fascinated by the untold stories that shaped our world, the battles that determined which language you speak and which god you pray to, hit that like button and subscribe for more epic war content. Now, let me take you back to the spring where Goliath once fell. To understand how 20,000 men changed the course of human history, we need to witness the horror that was approaching Egypt. The year before our battle, Baghdad, the jewel of Islamic civilization, had been erased. The Mongols didn't just conquer the city, they deleted it from existence. 800,000 people died in 7 days. The Tigris River ran black with ink from the countless books thrown into it, then red with blood. The House of Wisdom, repository of human knowledge since ancient times, burned for weeks. Leading this apocalypse was Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, a man Arab chroniclers called the Destroyer of Worlds. But Hulagu wasn't even leading the army approaching Egypt. That honor belonged to his most trusted general, Kitbuqa. And here's where it gets fascinating. Kitbuqa was a Christian, a Nestorian Christian, serving Buddhist Mongol masters, about to destroy the last major Islamic power on earth. The irony was lost on no one. Standing against this force was Sultan Qutuz of Egypt, and his story defies belief. Sold as a child slave in Damascus markets, he'd risen through the ranks of the Mamluk slave soldier system to become sultan just months before the Mongol threat materialized. But Qutuz had a secret weapon, his general Baibars, another former slave who'd fled to Egypt after killing his Mongol captors. Baibars knew Mongol tactics intimately. He'd studied them, lived them, escaped them, and he harbored a secret that would soon drench victory in blood. The Mongol Empire in 1260 stretched from Korea to Poland, the largest contiguous land empire in human history. They'd never lost a major battle since Genghis Khan united the tribes. Their strategy was consistent: surrender or face complete annihilation. No middle ground, no mercy, no exceptions. But as Hulagu's forces gathered like a plague of locusts, something happened 2,000 miles away that would save Cairo from Baghdad's fate. The Mongol force approaching Egypt wasn't their largest army, but it was perhaps their most experienced. 10,000 veterans of 50 battles, men who'd conquered from the steppes of Russia to the mountains of Afghanistan. Each warrior carried the devastating composite bow, a weapon that could punch through armor at 350 meters, more than double the range of anything the Mamluks possessed. They'd brought Korean siege engineers, the same specialists who'd reduced the walls of 400 fortresses to rubble. But here's what made this force truly terrifying. It wasn't just Mongols. 5,000 Armenian Christian auxiliaries rode with them, seeking revenge for centuries of Muslim rule. These weren't reluctant conscripts, they were eager participants in Islam's destruction. Georgian heavy cavalry, their homeland recently conquered, now served their conquerors with the zeal of converts. The Mongol genius wasn't just in fighting, it was in turning yesterday's enemies into today's weapons. What Kitbuqa didn't know was that he was leading this apocalyptic force toward men who understood his tactics better than any enemy he'd faced. The Mamluks were not born warriors, they were manufactured ones. Captured or purchased as young boys, usually between ages 6 to 10, they were put through a training regimen that would horrify modern military academies. No families, no identities beyond their regiment, no purpose except perfecting the art of war. The Egyptian force numbered 15,000 Mamluks plus 5,000 irregular cavalry, on paper, twice the Mongol strength. But numbers had never mattered to the Mongols before. What mattered was the killing ground, and Qutuz had chosen it carefully. The Jezreel Valley, where David once slew Goliath, offered something the open steppes didn't: hidden valleys, wooded hills, and most crucially, narrow passages where Mongol mobility meant nothing. But Qutuz had an ace hidden in his army, something that would make Mongol horses, trained since birth for war, panic like colts in a thunderstorm. Hand cannons, primitive, inaccurate, more noise than killing power, but the Mongols had never faced them. Sometimes in war, fear kills more effectively than arrows. The Mongols had never faced men who knew their tactics better than they did. Pre-battle psychological warfare began when Mongol envoys arrived at the Mamluk camp. They carried Kitbuqa's personal message: "You have seen what we did to Baghdad. Cairo will suffer worse. Your children will curse your names as they die." The chronicles record what happened next with brutal clarity. Qutuz had the envoys seized, not to negotiate, not to imprison. He had them cut in half at the waist, and their heads mounted on pikes facing north, toward the approaching Mongols. The message was clear: the age of surrender was over. This would be victory or annihilation. On September 3rd, 1260, as the morning sun rose over Galilee, two forces that should never have been equal prepared to collide. Dawn came with mist rising from the spring of Ain Jalut, mixing with dust from 35,000 warriors taking positions. The Mamluks had arrived first, Qutuz positioning his forces with the rising sun at their backs, an old trick, but effective. Mongol scouts reported the enemy deployment. Mamluk cavalry visible on the valley floor, banners flying, drums beating. It looked like typical Middle Eastern bravado. Kitbuqa had seen it 100 times before. They always stood. They always fought. They always died. Baibars commanded the vanguard, 3,000 riders positioned as bait. These were the finest Mamluk cavalry, men who could fire 3 arrows accurately while galloping at full speed. But their orders weren't to win. They were to bleed, retreat, and draw the Mongols into the valley narrows, where wooded hills pressed close on both sides. Baibars had studied Mongol feigned retreats for years. Now he would show them how it felt to be the prey. The first arrow exchange began at 400 meters. Extreme range for the Mamluks, optimal for the Mongols. The sky darkened with thousands of shafts. Mongol arrows struck with devastating force, punching through shield and armor. Mamluk casualties mounted quickly. In the first 10 minutes, 200 fell. The watching Mongols saw what they expected: an enemy already breaking. Initial skirmishes followed the predictable pattern. Mongol light cavalry swept forward, fired, wheeled away before the heavier Mamluks could respond. It was the steppe warfare that had conquered half the world. Mobility defeating mass, arrows defeating armor. Kitbuqa watched from his command position, satisfied. These Egyptians would fall like all the rest. Then Baibars did something no commander had ever dared against the Mongols. He ordered a full charge directly into their arrow storm. Mamluk heavy cavalry, men in 30 kilograms of armor on barded horses, thundered toward the Mongol lines. It was suicide, or it would have been, if it was real. Watch this moment carefully, because it defied 4 decades of military success. As the Mamluk charge reached 150 meters, optimal killing range, Baibars raised his lance. The charge shattered, not from Mongol arrows, but from a pre-planned signal. The Mamluks scattered in what looked like complete panic, horses colliding, men falling, weapons abandoned. Some fled north, others south. Most streamed back through the valley entrance in apparent terror. Kitbuqa should have recognized his own tactics, but rage blinded him. These were the men who'd killed his envoys, mounted their heads on pikes. The insult demanded blood payment. He ordered the pursuit. The Mongol force surged forward like a tsunami of horses and men. Armenian auxiliaries led, eager for Muslim blood. The valley narrowed from 3 kilometers to barely 400 meters. Hills rose on both sides, thick with oak and pine. Perfect terrain for ambush. But the fleeing Mamluks were too panicked to organize resistance. Or so it appeared. A Mongol scout named Kwangkurtai later survived to record what he saw. As we pursued deeper, I noticed birds, thousands of them, suddenly erupting from the hillsides. No wind, no visible cause. My horse's ears flattened. The war dogs stopped howling. Even nature knew something we didn't. In the hills above, 12,000 men waited with a new weapon that would terrify even Mongol warhorses. They'd been in position since midnight, forbidden to move, to speak, to even relieve themselves. Hour after hour in darkness, cramped muscles screaming, waiting for this moment. The feigned retreat continued for 3 kilometers. Mongol discipline, legendary across continents, began to fray. Units mixed as they pushed through the narrow passage. The perfect formations that allowed coordinated arrow volleys dissolved into a mob pursuit. Armenian Christians overtook Mongol units. Georgian cavalry pushed ahead, seeking glory. The army that conquered through coordination was becoming a rabble. Kitbuqa saw the danger, but calculated the risk as acceptable. Even disordered, his veterans could slaughter fleeing enemies. The spring of Ain Jalut was just ahead. Once the Mamluks were pushed past the water source, they'd have nowhere to run. The desert would kill whoever Mongol arrows missed. As the last Mongol warrior entered the valley narrows, Kutuz raised his hand. What happened next would echo across centuries. The trap sprung with choreographed precision. From concealed positions in the hills, 12,000 Mamluks erupted like demons from the earth. But the first sound wasn't the expected battle cry. It was thunder from a clear sky. Hand cannons, over 300 of them, fired in volley. The sound was like nothing in nature, nothing the Mongol horses had ever experienced. The smell, sulfur, and saltpeter sent warhorses trained since birth into pure panic. Here's what your history books won't tell you. It wasn't the killing power of these primitive firearms that mattered. At 100 meters, they could barely penetrate armor, but horses that would charge into a wall of spears that stood steady under arrow storm went mad with terror. They reared, threw riders, collided with each other. The Mongol front ranks, pressed by thousands behind them, became a writhing mass of animal panic. The flanking assault hit from 3 directions. Kutuz had divided his hidden force precisely, 4,000 from each hillside, 4,000 blocking retreat. The Mamluks descended like an avalanche of steel and horseflesh. Their battle cry, Allah Akbar, echoed off valley walls, seeming to come from everywhere. Watch what happened in those first catastrophic minutes. The Mongols, masters of mobile warfare, were compressed into a space where mobility meant nothing. Their composite bows, devastating at range, became awkward clubs in close combat. Armenian auxiliaries on the flanks, caught between Mamluks and panicking Mongols, had nowhere to maneuver. But then came the first reversal. The Syrian Muslim auxiliaries fighting with the Mongols suddenly turned on their allies. In the chaos, they began attacking Armenian Christians instead of Mamluks. Ancient hatreds erupted in the middle of battle. What had been a struggle between empires became a religious civil war. Mongol command structure, dependent on coordinating diverse forces, shattered. Individual combat vignettes tell the human story within the larger slaughter. A Mamluk champion named Aybak al-Afram faced a Mongol mounted archer in single combat. The Mongol fired 3 arrows in the time it took Aybak to close distance. All 3 struck true, but Mamluk armor held. Aybak's lance took the Mongol through the throat. As the Mongol fell, Aybak seized his bow, the weapon that conquered the world, and snapped it over his knee. In 20 minutes, 3,000 Mongols fell, more than in any single engagement since Genghis Khan united the tribes. The valley floor became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled so thick that horses struggled to find footing. Blood mixed with dust created a crimson mud that sucked at hooves. The narrow battlefield that prevented Mongol maneuver now prevented Mongol escape. But the Mongols were veterans of 50 battles. They didn't break. Kitbuqa rallied his guard, 2,000 men who'd followed him from China to Egypt. They formed a steel ring in the valley center, arrows lashing out with disciplined volleys. For a moment, Mamluk momentum stalled. Bodies piled before the Mongol position. The hand cannons, fired too rapidly, began exploding in Mamluk hands. The battle reached its crisis point. Despite the successful ambush, despite the terrain advantage, despite superior numbers, the Mamluks were taking horrific casualties. Mongol discipline was asserting itself. Units began forming squares, coordinating arrow volleys. The trap was working, but the prey might still break free. Then came the moment that military academies study 8 centuries later. Sultan Kutuz, watching his center begin to buckle, made a decision that defied every principle of medieval command. He tore off his helmet, the symbol of rank and protection, and spurred his horse toward the weakening line. His cry carries through history. O Islam, O Allah, grant your servant Kutuz victory over these Mongols. A sultan without a helmet was a dead man riding. Every enemy archer would target the exposed head, but that was precisely the point. Every Mamluk who saw their sultan's bare head in the front ranks understood this was victory or paradise. No middle ground remained. The Mamluk center, moments from collapse, exploded forward with renewed fury. Men who'd been retreating turned and charged. The wounded dragged themselves back into combat. The sight of their sultan, defenseless and leading from the front, transformed professional soldiers into religious warriors. But then, the Mongols played their own reversal, a feigned retreat, the tactic that built their empire. Kitbuqa's center suddenly gave way, streaming back in apparent disorder. It was perfectly executed. Pursuing Mamluks broke formation, exactly as planned. The trap within the trap was springing, except Baybars had anticipated this. He'd kept his personal guard, 1,000 men, completely out of the battle, waiting for this exact moment. As the Mamluk center pursued the fleeing Mongols, Baybars struck the exposed Mongol flanks. The feigned retreat became a real one. The masters of psychological warfare discovered their enemies had read their playbook. The sensory overload of ancient battle defies modern comprehension. Dust clouds rose so thick that men fought in brown twilight. The whistle of 50,000 arrows per hour created a sound like deadly rain. Dying horses screamed with almost human voices. Commands in Arabic, Mongolian, Turkish, and Armenian created a babel of confusion. The smell, blood, sweat, gunpowder, fear was overwhelming. Kitbuqa's position became untenable. Pressed from all sides, abandoned by auxiliaries, his army compressed into an ever-shrinking circle. Lesser commanders would have sought terms, but Kitbuqa was Mongol aristocracy, companion of Hulagu, veteran of the Chinese campaigns. Mongols didn't surrender. They conquered or died. His last stand became legendary even among enemies. Dismounting, a sign he would not flee, Kitbuqa formed his remaining guards into a final square. They sang the Mongol death song, the same chant their grandfathers sang riding with Genghis Khan. Arrow supplies exhausted, they drew swords, weapons almost ceremonial in Mongol warfare. The end came from multiple directions. Mamluk accounts differ on who struck the killing blow, perhaps because in the press of bodies, multiple warriors struck simultaneously. Kitbuqa fell with 17 wounds. The man who'd helped conquer half of Asia died in a valley he'd never heard of 6 months before. But then came yet another reversal. With Kitbuqa dead, Mongol discipline finally, completely shattered. It wasn't a retreat, it was dissolution. Men who'd conquered from sunrise to sunset ran like rabbits. They abandoned wounded comrades, unthinkable in Mongol tradition. They threw away weapons to run faster. The unbeatable became the broken. Statistical shock. 90% of the Mongol force died in 6 hours. This wasn't a defeat, it was extinction. Of 10,000 Mongols who entered the valley, perhaps 1,000 escaped. Of 5,000 auxiliaries, fewer survived. The cream of Mongol Western forces, the veterans who'd taken Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, all gone in an afternoon. But then came the cruelest reversal. The Mongol retreat toward Baisan became a death march. Qutuz had positioned blocking forces on every escape route. Local Syrians, who'd hidden from Mongols for months, emerged to attack stragglers. The 8-mile route from Ain Jalut to Baisan became littered with bodies. Mongol horses, exhausted from battle, collapsed. Warriors who'd crossed the Gobi Desert on foot died crawling toward water they'd never reach. As the sun set on September 3rd, 1260, the impossible had happened. But the battle's end would birth a betrayal that shaped Islam's future. The pursuit to Baisan was medieval warfare at its most merciless. No quarter was asked, none was given. Mamluks remembered Baghdad, Damascus, Aleppo, cities erased, populations slaughtered. This wasn't just victory, it was revenge served at sword point. Local villagers emerged from hiding places to strike at fleeing Mongols with farming tools. Children threw stones. Women poured boiling water from rooftops. A civilization that had cowered in terror for decades tasted vengeance. The final Mongol stand at Baisan lasted 2 hours. Perhaps 800 warriors, the last organized remnant, tried to hold the town's walls. They had no arrows, little water, no hope. The Mamluks brought up their hand cannons and blasted gaps in the defense. When Mamluk cavalry poured through, the killing was methodical. By midnight, the Mongol invasion force had ceased to exist. The death toll defied belief. Of 20,000 men who'd marched south with Kitbuqa, fewer than 2,000 escaped to tell Hulagu of the disaster. 18,000 Mongols and auxiliaries dead. Against this, the Mamluks lost 4,000, heavy casualties, but sustainable. For the first time in living memory, a Mongol army hadn't just been defeated, it had been annihilated. Kitbuqa's head, preserved in salt, was sent to Cairo. The general who'd promised to stable Mongol horses in Al-Azhar Mosque became a trophy displayed in the same mosque. His death represented more than military defeat. It was the death of Mongol invincibility. From Korea to Poland, the psychological impact was immediate. If former slaves could destroy a Mongol army, what else was possible? Damascus fell without battle. The Mongol garrison, learning of Ain Jalut, evacuated so quickly they left treasure vaults unlocked. Aleppo's Mongols didn't even try to hold. They fled at first rumor of approaching Mamluks. In 3 weeks, every Mongol position south of Anatolia was abandoned. The tide that had advanced for 43 years retreated in days. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you, the personal aftermath that would reshape history. Kutuz, wounded but victorious, rode through liberated Damascus to thunderous crowds. Flowers fell like rain. Women ululated from rooftops. The slave who became sultan was now the savior of Islam. Poets competed to compose praise songs. The man who'd been property was now propriety itself. Beside him rode Baibars, architect of victory, keeper of dark thoughts. The two men had risen together through slavery to power. They'd stood together against apocalypse. In 5 days, one would murder the other. The victory celebration exposed fractures within Mamluk leadership. Kutuz, generous in triumph, distributed captured territory among his generals, but not to Baibars. The slight was public, intentional, and fatal. Baibars had expected Aleppo as reward. He received nothing. In that moment of highest triumph, the seeds of tragedy were planted. What followed reads like Shakespeare, not history. On the march back to Cairo, Kutuz went hunting in the desert, a sultan's privilege after victory. His guards, loyal to Baibars, gradually fell back. In the desert silence, assassins closed in. Kutuz, the man who'd charged Mongols without a helmet, died reaching for a weapon he'd laid aside. Baibars struck the first blow, a knife between the shoulder blades. As Kutuz turned, recognition dawned with the blade. His last words, "Baibars, you too." The man who saved Islam died seeing his brother in arms become his murderer. In 5 days, Islam's greatest victory became its greatest betrayal. Statistical shock frames the tragedy. In 5 days, Islam's savior became its martyr. The man who'd turned certain annihilation into impossible victory died not from Mongol arrows but from Muslim knives. Baibars proclaimed himself sultan before Kutuz's body cooled. The army that had just saved civilization accepted the coup with minimal resistance. Power mattered more than principle. In death, Kutuz achieved what life denied: immortality in Muslim memory, as the martyr sultan who saved the faith. Baibars would rule for 17 years, expanding Mamluk power, fighting crusaders and Mongols alike. History judges him as the greater ruler, but history remembers Kutuz as the greater man. The battle was won, but its echoes would reshape 3 continents for the next 3 centuries. The long-term consequences of 6 hours at Ain Jalut ripple through our present. The Mamluk Sultanate, born in battle, would rule Egypt and Syria for 250 years. Former slaves became the Islamic world's shield against Mongol resurgence and crusader ambitions. The system that created warriors from chains became the Middle East's dominant military tradition until Napoleon. The Mongol Empire never recovered. Hulagu, receiving news of the disaster, could barely comprehend it. His veterans, the men who'd conquered from China to Iraq, were gone. The empire that seemed destined to reach the Atlantic fractured. Internal conflicts, always present but suppressed by victory, erupted. Within a generation, the unified Mongol Empire became competing kingdoms. The westward tide was broken forever. Think about that for a second. Christianity in Africa survived because 20,000 former slaves won an impossible battle. Without Ain Jalut, Mongol forces would have swept through Egypt into Africa. The Christian kingdoms of Nubia and Ethiopia, protected by Muslim buffer states, would have faced direct Mongol assault. The demographic and religious map of Africa would be unrecognizable. Europe, too, owes a debt to Mamluk cavalry. The Mongols had already reached Poland and Hungary. Only internal politics had recalled them from deeper European conquest. Had they consolidated Middle Eastern gains, renewed European campaigns were inevitable. The Renaissance might have been stillborn under Mongol hooves. The language you speak, the faith you follow, the culture you inhabit, all balanced on what happened at a Palestinian spring. But here's the philosophical paradox that haunts this victory. Slavery created freedom's defenders. The Mamluk system, brutal, inhumane, tearing children from families, produced the only force capable of stopping history's greatest conquerors. Men stripped of identity became Islam's identity. Warriors without homeland saved everyone's homeland. The greatest injustice created the greatest justice. Modern parallels echo ancient truths. David versus Goliath remains humanity's favorite story because it's repeatedly true. Empires that seem invincible, Mongol, Roman, British, Soviet, all eventually meet their Ain Jalut. The question isn't if, but when and where. Technology changes, tactics evolve, but the principle endures. Apparent weakness, properly applied, shatters apparent strength. The spring of Ain Jalut still flows today. Local Palestinians call it Ain Jalut, drawing water where Mongol horses last drank. The valley where David slew one giant saw another fall 2,200 years later. Geography becomes destiny. The same narrow passes that channeled Bronze Age armies trapped medieval cavalry. Time is circular at sacred springs. Would you throw away your helmet in the heat of battle? Kutuz's gesture, militarily insane, psychologically brilliant, exemplifies leadership's paradox. Sometimes survival requires embracing death. The Sultan who made himself the obvious target became the impossible to abandon leader. His bare head above the battle line drew arrows and inspired armies. Courage isn't absence of fear, it's correct action despite terror. 20,000 former slaves didn't just win a battle, they won the future itself. Every mosque